it is very clear that the quality of human life is directly related to energy usage. Bitcoin, at the essence, attacks the wealth and power infrastructure of the world as it exists today.
My guest today is Bob Burnett.
I'm the CEO of Barefoot Mining, which is a Bitcoin mining company. We've been doing that since 2017. I'm also on the board of directors of Ocean, which is one of the world's most well-known mining pools in the world, which launched about a year ago. And my background is from the personal computer industry, and I spent a couple decades, starting in the mid 80s to the mid part of the first decade, working in that industry, most notably as the chief technical officer at Gateway.
All right. I had a Gateway computer or two back in the day. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate the support in hindsight. And it always makes me feel good. You know, I'm very blessed to have worked in an industry like that where, you know, we were touching, at our prime, we were making about 10 million PCs a year. And it's great because, you know, as I go around and I meet new people, it's so common for people to say, oh, my family had one. When I was in college, I had one. And that always makes me feel good. I don't know other way to put it, that it was a little part of whatever journey that person had.
So as I was saying before we hit record, I really enjoyed listening to you talk about your background on podcasts, et cetera, because you've kind of been everywhere. You were there for the whole PC revolution and for the internet. And then after that, Bitcoin. And you were one of the first people to use an MP3 player.
Yeah. I consider myself very blessed that I guess I had the right background and the right interests going well back into the late 70s when I started coding on predecessors to the personal computer, like early computers before the IBM PC. And then when I got out of college, with a degree in computer engineering, got hired to a company called Zenith, which older members of the audience would remember as a major TV brand, but they had a personal computer division, and was blessed to work on the development team of what I consider to be the world's first laptop and a lot of the early personal computers. And so you're right, I was part of that when it was in its infancy, and got to grow through that, grew personally and professionally with that, and got to feel and experience that. And then, of course, I look at the personal computer as the base layer of the internet. That had the personal computer not reached critical mass, then the internet would have never taken off. That without tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people on personal computers, the internet doesn't work. There's something called Metcalfe's law, which I don't know if you've ever heard of Metcalfe's law, but it says that the power of a network grows by the square of the number of the users, which is just a mathematical way of saying every time somebody new comes onto a network, the network gets exponentially more powerful. And so I got to see that occur too. And, you know, got to see not only how the markets and society adopted these things, but also how the companies that were trying to address that market, these super high growth markets, what happened to them? How did they grow through this? And what you'll find, by the way, is very few are able to navigate it. That I'm going to oversimplify this a bit. It's not that difficult in a high growth market to launch a company and find a little bit of early success. If you're in the right place, like you'll be successful. What's really hard is to sustain that. And because as soon as you start finding success, what you find is that you're presented with all kinds of issues that you have to grow personally. The organization has to grow. The personnel has to grow. The quality of the processes you have, the the quality of the technology that you use inside the organization has to scale. And if any one of those doesn't work right, your company stops growing, or you miss a product cycle, and it's death. And so it's you know, and you see that, right? If you look, for most people maybe listening to this show would be more familiar with what happened with the internet than with the personal computer. But in both cases, if you look at the companies that were the leaders in the early days, in the first, let's say 5 to 10 years of that technology entering the mainstream, almost none of them made it. You know, somebody else emerged, you know, out of the ashes of those companies. And most of the problems are self-inflicted. By the way, it's usually a failure of the company itself to navigate this that causes the problem. And so here we are with, so anyway, I know I'm being very verbose, but you know, here we are with Bitcoin, and now I think we're at the same point, right? You know, so we kind of at that inflection point where Bitcoin is moving from this early part of the adoption curve that kind of is existing outside the viewpoint of the mainstream of people, and then it rapidly goes you know, into the mainstream. I think we're right there right now. There's an inflection point in that curve that we're sitting at right now today.
So it seems to me that you're perfectly positioned to understand this stuff because, as you were saying, you were there to see the pieces get laid down that needed to be there before we could have Bitcoin. We had to have computers. We had to have them networked. And then you studied Austrian economics first, well before you even heard about Bitcoin. Isn't that right?
Yeah. And it relates to a certain degree back to what happened to me. So I have been was very fortunate. I was part of, as I mentioned, Gateway, and I went there relatively early in the formation of Gateway. I was there and part of the team that took Gateway public. And for those that are not as familiar, by the year 2000, Gateway was about the 5th largest PC company in the world. We were doing $10 billion a year in revenue. We had $1 billion in profit. We were making 10 million PCs. We had 25,000 employees. That's how big, you know, we were. And for having been part of that ride, hopefully I contributed some, but I was part of the ride. I had done really well financially. And so what had happened was I started to divest a little bit. Like I had all these stock options and I started to sell them. But then I'm faced with the question, what do I do with it, right? Or where do I take my money? And I was still busy and active. It wasn't something I felt I could handle myself. So I went to 3 different financial advisors. I said I had a big pile of money, right? I went to 3 different financial advisors and said to each of them, I will give you each a third. And they all wanted to convince me, no, that they should have it all and they'll do much better if they have it all. So no, I'm going to give you it a third. I'm trying to be as conservative as possible. And my direction to each of them was grow this pile of money. It took a lot out of me to get it. I don't want to lose it. Well, and I should point out that process had started in the late 90s, probably like 97, 98, I started it. So in the early 2000s, there was something called the .com bubble that burst. And I was in the middle of it, right? I was still at Gateway. I was the CTO there at that time. And it was a difficult period for any technology company. Very, very difficult period. And a few years after that, so I mean, maybe we'll call it 2003-ish. I might be off by the year. So I went and talked to these financial advisors and realized that all 3 of them, the pile of money I had given them was now smaller than when I started with them. And this is multiple years passing. So not only was the pile smaller, but I was certainly cognizant enough of economics to realize that the purchasing power of a dollar had dropped in that period as well, right? So I was not only down in terms of absolute dollars, but I was really down in terms of purchasing power. And it upset me. So I started pulling my money out and saying, well, I'm sure I can do better than them. There's got to be a way. And I had lost faith in Wall Street. There's a little tangent I can tell you about that as well. I'd lost faith in Wall Street. I lost faith in banking. And even though I also have a minor degree in economics, always been an interest area for me. But it was Keynesian thought. And so I said, there's got to be something different. And I started just looking for something new. And I stumbled upon the Austrian school of thought and started reading some of the works of Hayek and Rothbard and von Mises, and learned that there was a completely different way to look at economics. And this inherent belief that seems to permeate academia, the banking industry, and Wall Street, of this centrally controlled method of managing economy is flawed. And it's somewhat a belief that we can play God with the economy and move these levers. And the truth of the matter is, as men try to move levers to move and nudge the economy one way or the other, they are playing God. And at some point, there's a price to pay for that. And that an economy should be thought of as a living, breathing organism. And you can't try to control it. It needs to be free. And as soon as you try to constrain it, it will eventually do everything it can to bust out, right? So that's and that resonated with me, like so yeah. So the answer to your question was, I came into the kind of the Austrian thought process well before Bitcoin by 12 or 15 years. I was, before I found Bitcoin, I was already thinking. And, what I like to say is, it's my belief that, technology and the Austrian school of thought had a baby, and that was Bitcoin. Like it's kind of where these two things came together, and Bitcoin embodies the development of mankind technologically with the Austrian school of thought, and that is Bitcoin.
So would you say then the money system right now is broken and Bitcoin fixes it? You believe that, correct or no?
Yeah, I mean, yes. If you had to said you only have one sentence to describe the situation, money and the monetary system, there are two different things, by the way. It's important to always think of that. And we'll talk about Bitcoin more, I'm sure, but it's always important to remember that Bitcoin is both a money and a monetary system, and it's other things too. And those are two distinct things. Like you can the ownership of the money and the control of the monetary system are two different things. And so if you look at it, the U.S. is a very wealthy country. We have a lot of wealth as a country. The citizens have a lot of wealth, but citizens don't control the monetary system. We have the Federal Reserve, somewhat in combination with the government, control the monetary system. And the monetary system, not just of the U.S., but of the world. And they use that monetary system well beyond the normal confines of economic activity. They use it as a weapon and a means of control. And I think part of the reality, I think the reality of this is starting to become apparent to a lot of people. Hopefully a lot of people have heard about central bank digital currencies and what that might mean for them at the individual level. That's what I say as a means of control. So the ability of money now to be a way, and access to money as a way of controlling the individual. In China, you have a social credit score, and your access to your money is in direct relationship to that social credit score. Not just how much of it you get to keep, but where you can spend it and when you can spend it are also under the control of the government. And to me, that's a very dystopian, scary world. But there's a second piece, which is at the nation state level and the geopolitical side, which is, as an example, the Biden administration, and I don't mean to be political with this, but the Biden administration, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, used money as a weapon. And what they did was they kicked the Russians off of the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is, think of it as the bank-to-bank network that connects the banks of the world and allows money to move internationally. They just got kicked off. Well, that caused a lot of problems for them. They couldn't access some of their own assets, but even more importantly, they couldn't sell things and buy things from other countries. And, you know, that's a really big deal. Well, on the surface, it did its job. What I call the level one implications of the decision were accurate. The Biden administration put a lot of pain on the Russians. The problem was that it sent a message to the 200 other nations of the world that should you ever fall out of line, we have the means to completely isolate your country from the global economy. And that immediately started rippling through the world. And it resulted in the formation of BRICS, if you're familiar with that, but, you know, Brazil, Russia, China, India, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And now I think there's about 40 countries in the coalition, which have said we will develop an alternative monetary system that allows the countries within BRICS outside of the SWIFT system to do commerce. So, you know, in other words, the pain was temporary. Now they can go around it. Now, Bitcoin would say, interestingly, I think the Bitcoin community, the Bitcoin protocol says, we don't care. We are not a political body. Money should not be a weapon. Money should not be a means of control. It guarantees the financial sovereignty of the individual and, to a certain degree, the nation. We can potentially talk about that a little bit. If they utilize it, if they participate, then this ability for the state to control them, or for one state to economically isolate another one, goes away.
So do you think oil is already being purchased some places using Bitcoin?
Yes, I'm certain of it. And I think way beyond that. I should point out, I can't say I have direct evidence, but between Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, all these kinds of countries, I am sure that there is a massive amount of commerce and trade occurring in Bitcoin. It's I think sometimes used politically. This capability, in fact, gets used. The Elizabeth Warren faction, for instance, I think likes to say, you know, Bitcoin is the fodder of criminals and money launderers and all that. And sure, there's some activity that goes on. But I would also say that even though I think from the perspective of the typical person in the West, we look at those countries as evil, as dark, as the enemy, it's my opinion that it is improper for a monetary system to be a judge and jury on those sorts of things. So I completely support the right of those countries and the people within those countries to utilize a monetary system like Bitcoin to do business with whomever they want, with whatever they want. Now, if they're doing something illegal, sure, you can go chase them and prosecute them. And the beauty of Bitcoin is that transactions are marked forever. So it's not, I've had a few conversations with some government folks before and some things I can't even talk about, but they don't hate Bitcoin because it leaves a permanent trail. You know, a cash transaction, if you don't catch the cash transaction at the point of the cash transaction, and let's say it's, you know, it's a drug deal, right? You really can't chase that down. But in Bitcoin, you leave a bit of a breadcrumb that does provide some possibility of using that to catch bad guys. But the monetary system doesn't become the judge and the jury. And, you know, I think that's something people should be really, really concerned about. That, you know, we live in a world where if we reverse the clock 150 years, there was really no ability for money to be used as a means of control or as a weapon. You know, people used, actually, this is some silver right here. You know, people use these kinds of things to do transactions, and occasionally they would use banknotes or the equivalent of checks, but you know, largely it was real money. This would be a form of real money to do commerce. We now live in a world where people have, for the sake of convenience, I think, let themselves drift into these very dangerous situations, and they've fallen for the rhetoric of people, usually politicians and regulators, that say, well, if you're not doing something wrong, don't worry, you don't have anything to, we won't come after you. You have, you know, and now that's always a really dangerous Klaus Schwab sort of, you know, position. Like, oh yeah, you have nothing to worry about as long as you're not doing anything wrong.
So you mentioned that you think we're at some sort of inflection point here. If you look at your crystal ball, how do you see things playing out in the next 5 or 10 years, where Bitcoin is off as kind of an alternate form of payment, or it takes control, or it becomes the form of payment at some point, 10, 20 years down the road?
Let's just pick one time frame, and I'll hazard a guess. So let's say a decade.
Okay.
So I think within a decade, so we'll talk a 10-year horizon, I believe there is a material, although still minority, part of the global economy that runs on Bitcoin. So you'll have country to country commerce that occurs in pockets in Bitcoin. You'll have pockets, especially in second and third world countries, that start rejecting the local currency and prefer Bitcoin as the means of exchange. In other words, maybe an employee getting their wages will say, I'd rather be paid in Bitcoin. But it will not be the dominant. It will not be the dominant form, but it will be material. I also believe that you'll see it in the treasury of most nation states by that point. based on the election and what seems to be happening, some of that may be happening at a timetable even that an optimist like me is a little surprised by. But I think, we'll see it in, major countries. I think you'll see basically every financial institution have an arm of their organization that works exclusively in Bitcoin. And we can talk about mining later, but mining, which is essentially means the ability to control and have access to what transactions occur in the network, will become, within 10 years, it will be known to financial institutions that will be an existential requirement. Either they have it and they are able to do it, or they lose all their major customers. So I think that's my best guess on the 10-year piece. I think that it's probably a 20 to 30-year window where it becomes the dominant monetary network and the dominant monetary asset of the world. And the unit of account starts to change from the dollar to Bitcoin. Meaning, money is a language. So we like to say money is a language. And so it's the language of value. And so if Tom, if you and I go into some shopping mall and we start pulling people over and we ask them, how much is this mouse worth? How much is this phone worth? They'll give you a number and it'll be expressed in dollars, right? And what they're really telling you is their perception of the current value of the US dollar against that thing, right? So they are thinking in dollars. And I think 20 years from now, we'll have seen people transition to where their predominant way of expressing value is Bitcoin. So when they ask them how much the phone is worth, they'll say 10,000 Satoshis instead of $500 or whatever they.
All right. I have a few things I wrote down about the math involved and the scaling of this. I want to just read these out and see if I have this right. I think the mean block time is about 10 minutes, or a new block about every 10 minutes. The median block time, I think you said, is 6 minutes, 40 seconds. Half
Correct.
Faster, half slower. Number of blocks per year is about 53,000 per year. Transactions per block is about 4,000. And that comes out to about 7 transactions per second. Is that okay so far? A couple more here.
Yeah, we can come back to the 7 transactions per second part.
Okay.
It's accurate, but I don't like expressing it that way. But
okay.
I'll tell you why.
All right. Last two things I have here. Transactions per year, maybe about 200 million. And then the number of years to distribute 1 Satoshi to each of the 8 billion of us, it would take 40 years. It would take all the transactions for 40 years to do that. I think you were arguing that we're not going to all be working on the base layer because of that. We're going to have to go up a layer or two. All right. Go ahead and.
Yes. Yeah. So everything you've said is exactly right. The only reason I don't really like talking about transactions per second is that when the mining process occurs and a block gets processed, it's not just how can I express it? There's more work being done than just processing those transactions. The network is also being secured. And so what will happen is Bitcoin Bitcoin will get criticized sometimes because what they'll say is transactions per second is a common way within the fiat world of expressing the power of the fiat network. The Fedwire can do this many transactions per second. Visa can do this many, etc. And then what happens is some of Bitcoin's adversaries will say, well, Bitcoin can only do 7 transactions per second, and it's consuming this much energy. Therefore, it's consuming this much energy per transaction, and that's highly inefficient. And say, well, that energy, the transactions per second is true, but the energy and the computing power is doing a lot more than just those transactions. And so I only objected to your verbiage because it's been an attack vector for a lot of the other folks who completely mischaracterize Bitcoin's energy usage and the fact that, well, I should say the fact that they view it in a highly negative way. And I get very frustrated by how frequently mainstream media, print and news outlets regurgitate this information and perpetuate this mantra about Bitcoin being this evil thing. In fact, I've always found it kind of interesting because the biggest objectors to Bitcoin have historically come from progressives. And again, I'm not here to be political, but I've always viewed Bitcoin as really the savior for the small guy. Like, it has so many benefits to the small guy and the average person. And it doesn't create as much advantage for the upper 1%. Yet what I found is that it's been supported more by the upper middle and high income groups and the political groups aligned with them more than the progressives. And it's created a bit of a disillusionment, I'd say, for me, about the integrity of a lot of the people on the progressive side. Because what I've said is, well, you either haven't really investigated Bitcoin, or what you really don't believe in your progressive agenda. Like, you use it as a front, but what you really want is you want a money printer. You want centralized control. You want a small group of people to make all the key decisions. Because if you wanted otherwise, you would be all in on Bitcoin. And that doesn't seem to be happening, though.
I mean, do you think Elizabeth Warren really does understand that for the ordinary working person, we shouldn't fire up the money printer and blow it on foreign wars, that type of thing? Does she understand that?
You would think so. That's why I said I was never a fan. I do want to say that up front, but she, she's very virtuous. She's very holier than thou. I think she believes she knows what's good and bad, and she doesn't put faith in individuals to make good decisions for themselves. So like I said, I'm very disillusioned by it, but it's opened my eyes to a whole bunch of things. You know, I would say I started feeling, I think I'm 60 years old now. I would say for the first 35 years of my life, which would include most of the time period in which I was at Gateway, I was part of a Fortune 200 company. I had faith in the system that You know, I felt like Wall Street and people in high finance and the big bankers and the politicians, that they must be really intelligent people, and they must be largely people of integrity. But then I started meeting them, by the way. I mean, my position at Gateway put me in a spot where I got to interact with a lot of these sort of people. And let's say, like, I don't want to point out individuals, but I would say I was wholly unimpressed with these. And like a great example would be, so Gateway was a public company and a large one. So we had Wall Street analysts that covered us, and they're the people that will make, like, when you're watching MSNBC or Squawk Box or whatever, and they say, such and such a Smith Barney now has a buy recommendation on Gateway stock. Well, like, I would have met the guy and he would have interviewed me, and I would have talked to him about whether, you know, to help him do that analysis. Well, what I learned was, one, I was on the whole very unimpressed with these people. They really weren't very smart. I interacted on a daily basis in the personal computer with people that were way smarter, number one. Number two, he really didn't care, or she didn't care too much about the details. They really didn't want to understand what we were doing. They just wanted a little bit of information ahead of the curve. And that was the whole game, was, you know, and I was coached, because there's legal things about this. Like, you know, they want a little bit of inside information. I can't give it to them, but depending on what our finance people wanted and what we could say, you could maybe give some clues. All they wanted was volatility in the stock. That's all they wanted. They did not want the stock to be a nice and steady grower. They wanted it to be able to have sensational news that would drive it up quickly or down quickly, because that's how they made money, right? They would be ahead of the curve. If they're going to give a strong buy recommendation, they know that before anybody else, and so they buy ahead of their strong buy recommendation. If they're going to reduce the rating, they know they're going to do that ahead of the curve, and the stock price is going to fall. So in other words, they're kind of directing this. And so, like, I used to be bound by insider trading laws. So I couldn't buy or sell stock, nor could I exercise options or things like that, except in very small windows. Like, there were 4 times a year. I might have 7 to 10 days, 4 times a year, where I could trade Gateway stock. Well, it wouldn't have mattered, honestly, because as we reported news, we would announce new products, we would announce an expansion, or maybe we had bad news. Hey, we're missing our number. We're laying people off. I was wrong as often as I was right about whether or not the market would react positively or negatively to the news. In other words, announce a layoff, stock goes up. Announce a new product line, stock goes down. Like, there was no relationship to it. And I learned that it was all because of the volatility. That's what they wanted. They wanted volatility. They wanted to know which direction the volatility was going. And that's how they made their money. And that became very disillusioning to me. This wasn't about how good we were as a company. It was about, in the short term, which direction was the stock going, and they just wanted to know. That was it. Bottom line of the whole thing.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I've heard Michael Saylor talk about that, about selling the volatility of MSTR stock. I don't know if you followed that someone, I guess, really wants volatility in all stocks, including that one, to this day.
Correct. Yep. That's what they want. Because nobody if a stock just sits there and it goes up 2% a year, it's $100 a share, and it sits at $100 a share the whole year, and then, maybe it ticks up 25 cents here and 10 cents here, and then it falls 10 cents. Like, nobody cares. There's no money to be made. But even if the end result is the same thing, like if it goes from 100 to 102 in the course of the year, meaning it quote unquote kept up with inflation, right? That's a whole different rabbit hole. But if instead it starts at 100, it drops to 80, goes to 95, goes back to 82, up to 110, and at the end of the year lands at 102, we're at the same spot. But the stock that was all over the place is a stock that's going to have heavy trading volume, and the Wall Street types, the hedge fund managers, the traders, they're going to love it. The one that just sat there, and you would think that's a nice, well-run company, nice and steady, right? No, not interesting.
Okay, so, you started talking about facing up to some of the attacks on Bitcoin, but I think before you've said it's important to lay out first the case for Bitcoin. I don't know if you have an elevator pitch, a very short one when people ask you, what's the case for Bitcoin? And then do you have a small one also about addressing the attacks, that it uses too much energy, that type of thing?
Yeah. Well, Bitcoin was created for two reasons, fundamentally. And the first reason is that 5,000 years of monetary history shows that whenever you give a person or organization control over money, they will screw it up. Now, that could be mismanagement and that could be greed. It's usually a combination of both. But you give them control over money, they will ruin it.
It's 100%, isn't it, so far?
So 100% track record, yes, for 5,000 years. I think there are a couple currencies, maybe like the Swiss franc or something like that, that are now 200-300 years old. But every other currency in the world is very, very modern and current, and they fail all the time. So maybe Bitcoin is a testament saying that we should learn our lesson now and realize that we should not give control of money to people, and we should let it run in a decentralized way, rules without rulers. We'll talk about what that means later. And then we have a fair chance at something that won't be manipulated. That's transparent. That gives everybody a fair chance and a level playing field. So I think that's the first tenet of Bitcoin. Remove money from the state, the management of money from the state. And the second is, and it's greatly needed, right? And the second piece is that as we move into a digital world, we need an equivalent of cash that allows two parties, Bob and Tom, or whomever two parties are in the world, to do transactions in a way that requires no intermediary. And we now live in a society where that ability has largely gone away. I've walked into, for instance, many establishments that no longer accept cash. And that should be a scary thing. It means that using the digital tools of the fiat world means I have to leave a footprint everywhere I go. I lose my anonymity. And remember the thing I told you about before? Well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about. Well, obviously, I believe that's bullshit. And we have to fight against that. So Bitcoin also solves that problem. And one of its key technological innovations was the ability to do that in a digital world. One of Satoshi Nakamoto's truly brilliant technological innovations was to create a way for that to happen. So that, I mean, there's a lot of other things about Bitcoin, but removing money from the state and allowing two people to interact without a third party are the fundamental tenets of its existence.
I just saw some buddy with a lot of followers on Twitter said that Bitcoin solves a problem that doesn't exist. But I could not disagree more with that statement. It does solve a big problem that does exist. Yeah.
So, I mean, I just gave you two.
Right.
You know, and we can go deeper, but I think, you know, we can overwhelm people too. Right. I can talk about self-custody. I love I mean, if I was to go to three, I would then go to, you know, the fixed money supply as the third tenant, you know, the 21 million cap and inflation and all that. But that's really a sub part of number one. You know, the fixed money supply is really a sub part of removing control from the state. So I think when we look at the world's problems, poverty in the third world, even in first world countries, massive wealth disparities, a lot of things that fly under social injustice, things that I think appear to be racism or, you know, environmental problems, I think are rooted in the way that the current monetary system works. And I, by the way, don't think they will ever be solved unless you first fix money. That it will, you know, politicians will come in, right or left, I don't care. I think they both are, even the good, mostly they're lying, but even the good intention ones really don't have the tools to fix these problems unless they fix money. And like ultimately, like we talk about things like in the U.S., I assume most of your listeners are U.S. based, talk about like returning manufacturing to the United States. Well, what no politician I'm aware of since 1960 has talked about is something called the Triffin Dilemma, which was proposed by a senator called Robert Triffin. And he went to Congress and he said, gentlemen, we have a problem. The problem is that the United States is the world's reserve currency, something I think most people would look at least in the U.S., as a very favorable thing. That, you know, it's our albatross. It's going to drag us down. And the reason is that in order to be the world's reserve currency, you must be a net exporter of money and importer of goods. And the only way that happens is you have to buy more stuff from other countries and sell less to them as well. And ultimately that means the manufacturing base will collapse. Because other countries, if you want to be the world's reserve currency, and you not only want them to do commerce with you in dollars, but you want them to interact with each other in dollars, there has to be a way more dollars outside the U.S. than inside the U.S. This is called the Triffin Dilemma, by the way. And for them to have a bunch of dollars to do commerce with each other, well, they have to sell us something. There's only one way for them to get dollars, and that's to sell us something. So would they undercut our costs just to get dollars? The answer is yes. We put them in that position. When we say, now I'm not saying all acts are malicious, are not malicious, but a whole bunch of them are not malicious. They are just the result of the situation, which is the world now demands payment in dollars. So when Russia buys something from Peru, actually that's a bad example. Let me say Germany buys something from Peru, they typically demand dollars. So Peru demanding dollars from Germany means Germany has to get dollars from somewhere. Well, how are they going to get dollars? Well, they're going to sell something to somebody in the U.S. that has dollars. And if that means they sell it at a significantly lower profit margin than they normally would, but it allows them now to be viable internationally, they will do that. So that puts pressure on the U.S. manufacturers and, hence the situation we are. So that's a very long-winded way of saying the only way out for the U.S. is to no longer be the world reserve currency. We must ultimately give that position up. And if other countries are smart, they won't want to be it either. We need a currency that's not tied to the economy of any one country for this to work. And once it does, though, once we have a world currency that's not tied to any one country's economy, now we have a level playing field. Now import and export and trade occurs purely on the basis of that trade and not by this external factor of the demand for money.
All right. So you could look way down the road 50 years maybe or something and see Bitcoin as that reserve currency potentially?
Yeah, I think 20 to 30 is the window where that happens. And things happen. The concept of exponential change is very difficult for people to grasp when they're looking forward. Then when they look backward, they realize what they've gone through. So you and I in our lifetimes, we've experienced this in the personal computer. We've experienced it in the internet. We've experienced it with the cell phone. Like all these sorts of things have had these massive adoption curves. Like, do you mind if I ask how old you are, Tom?
I am 63. I'm older than you.
Okay. So we're contemporaries.
Yeah.
So in 1998, did you have a cell phone?
I did not. No.
Yeah. 2008, I bet you did.
I think I did around then. Yeah.
Yeah. And by 2018, it was probably so critical to your life, you never left the house without it.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a less than 20-year curve from 1998. Now I know they were expensive and they didn't work as well, but in 1998, they existed. And by 2008, we're already in the beginning of the smartphone era. And then 10 years after that, probably well under 10 years after that, they were like, they're ubiquitous and you gotta have it. Otherwise you don't even feel comfortable. Like, right. I hate to say it because I am that way. Like I'll give you an example. Like I played golf this weekend and I was in a golf cart and I left the cell phone inside the golf cart and I left the course and I had been away for like 10 minutes. And at that point realized like, where's my phone? Right. And, like you turned and beeline back in there, like almost in an embarrassingly flustered position. Like, where is it? And, it made me feel badly, but it only took me being away from that cell phone for less than 10 minutes for me to realize it wasn't there. Like
Good point.
That's how short that would have been, but in 2008, it might've taken me hours to realize that this thing wasn't with me.
So there's a Bitcoin book called Gradually Then Suddenly. And do you think that maybe is happening with Bitcoin, that we're right on the edge of suddenly here?
Yeah, that's Parker Lewis's book. Parker's a great guy. He's a friend of mine. And yes, that is a way of describing exponential adoption, or Metcalfe's law, as we talked about before, that the pace that you grow. So If Metcalfe's law is the power of a network grows by the square of the number of users, when we have, let's say, 1 million users in the world, and then we go to 10 million, it's not just 10 times more powerful. It's way more than that, right? And then when you go to 100 million, and then you go to 1 billion, and that curve is just like taking off through that. So that's how these things happen. It happened in the personal computer era. You know, the personal computer from 1986 to 1996 to 2006. Use the same kind of 20-year window. 1986, nobody had them. Like they were on a few desks. You would have been early in your career, probably at the same time. You might not have even had one in 1986 at your desk. Maybe not. By 1996, I guarantee you had one on your desk, and you probably had one in your house too. You may not have one for every member of your family, but you had one in your house, and everybody in your business had one. By 2006, everybody had one. Most people had two. They might have a desktop and a laptop, and that laptop goes with them if they're traveling. Like they're already so connected to the world, like they cannot exist, much like the cell phone to a certain degree, right? That like my wife and I were in Spain last week. There's no way I would have gone to Spain without my laptop with me, even though we were on vacation. Like there's no way I'm not going and checking email every day, which is sad, but that's the truth.
I think you mentioned elsewhere that there was a huge growth in Comdex, that it just exploded in size, but then it went away. And you thought maybe Bitcoin conferences might follow that too, that after Bitcoin, kind of, if it does take over, then the conferences might follow that same path. Is that possible?
Yeah. Well, it should. I mean, same thing with like the internet. There's no internet conference. There may be niche things, right, that are going on. So I think there's a natural pattern that when something starts, like the pattern that you're referring to that I've talked about in the past for the personal computer, in the late 70s, there was this conference called Comdex that started running. And initially it was a few hundred people, the real geeks, like the real, and I would have been one of those kind of people. And through the 80s, it continued to run. Into the early 90s, it continued to run. It was slowly gaining from a few hundred people to a few thousand people to 10,000 people. By 1998, it grew to 225,000 people attending this one conference in Las Vegas every November. Right about like right now, usually right before Thanksgiving. 6 years later, it was done. They didn't even hold it anymore. So what happened in those 6 years? You might think, did the personal computer go away? No, what happened was it became so ubiquitous, it was no longer exciting. Like that it was just part of everyday life. And I think the same thing will happen to Bitcoin for those that listen. Like there's conferences all over the world all the time. The big one being the one put by Bitcoin Magazine, and they have one in Asia, one in the U.S., one in Europe as well. But like the one in Nashville was it July?
July. I was there. You were there.
Were you there? Yeah. So that was about 22 to 25,000 people. And I'm guessing next year in Las Vegas, interesting, they're moving to the same place that counter. Because I think what happens is Vegas is like one of the few cities when you start growing and you get into that tens of thousands, who has enough hotel rooms and to handle this many people. There aren't that many places. Even big cities like LA and New York, they kind of struggle with that because there's all kinds of other things. Vegas is about that conference primarily. So anyway, And I've told this to some of the Bitcoin magazine people, the day will come where the conference probably fizzles away. Doesn't mean they were doing a bad job. Just means that like it's just not that exciting anymore. And that's when you win. Like it's so ubiquitous, it's so ingrained that you win. No, I think we still have a few exciting years left. And I encourage people out there that if you've never been to a conference, that would be fun to go to Vegas, but there's regional ones all over the place. And if you've never been to a meetup, that's a great thing because we are still a community. We're not ubiquitous where everybody's a Bitcoin. Like we're a little different still. We're, and I find it very refreshing to go to some of these places and interact with these people because you'll find that you very quickly become friends with people because you come from this so similar perspective of the world. Like you skip a whole bunch of levels of the friendship because, okay, right away, our ethics and morals and perspective on the world are almost certainly within the same lane.
I had one more question about the U.S. $35 trillion deficit. Do you think there's any hope that a strategic Bitcoin reserve can somehow help get us out of that? Or is there hope that somehow we can get out of this mess we're in?
I think it crossed 36 today, by the way.
Did it?
I think I read that. But this is going to sound bad. The answer is not really. I don't think Bitcoin is the answer to that. I think the answer to that is stop spending more than you're bringing in. Over time you could maybe nick away at it. Bitcoin can help somewhat with it. I still think a Bitcoin strategic reserve for the U.S. is a good thing, but the deficit, I think, is got to be fixed at the core. I hope what they're trying to do, which is cut spending, happens because I'm quite the DOGE, right? The Ramaswamy Musk group. I think that's what's needed. When it's reminiscent, not that I've ever been involved with the U.S. government, but if, I've been part of a 25,000 person company, as I mentioned, as a C-suite executive. And it was in that time period, I think I mentioned, around 2001, actually, when we hit some really hard times. And we had to go in as an executive team and look at all 25,000 people, all of our locations, all of our activities, all the things we spent money on. And really, after a decade of phenomenal success, there was a lot of fat. That's just the reality. Like, people that maybe were necessary are no longer necessary. Inefficient systems that just were bleeding money, locations that made sense 5 years ago that no longer made sense. I mean, like all these sort of things, and they're hard decisions because you know what, you do impact people's lives. It's really hard. I still have flashbacks to, like, I'll never forget because it was this time of year. We were going through that period. Gateway had a facility in Vermilion, South Dakota. It was a call center. And we had gone through this exercise. And it was a smaller call center, I believe like 125 people. And we had much bigger, more efficient call centers all over the country, all over the world, actually. And it just didn't make sense to keep that one open. And we had to cut costs. And I remember distinctly having to, as the lead executive in the area, drive to that facility one day in December, about 2 weeks before Christmas, and stand on a podium in front of all these people as we announced that we were immediately closing the facility and they all lost their jobs, and like turn your computer off, file out the door over here. There'll be an HR representative that will talk with each of you independently about your severance package. Like, and I remember the class with which those people took the news, but I also remember like the ashen look on their faces, you know, tears running down people's faces. To this day, this is almost 25 years later now, right? I remember the faces, like, and I remember thinking, this person or that person is going home tonight to tell their spouse and tell their kids that they just lost their job. And here it is right before Christmas. And maybe they're saying, hey, remember you were going to get, you know, the Game Boy for Christmas? Well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to wait on that. Or and these kids then being impacted, like, and it tears you apart. But at some point, if you don't make those decisions, then the whole thing falls apart. Like you're dead. Like everybody dies, right? And so the DOGE people, they're going to have to go in and make a lot of those decisions. And there's going to be a lot of sob stories. And they're probably real sob stories of people whose lives were really negatively impacted by this. But as you said, the $36 trillion is, even as a math and science person, it's a number I don't believe I really understand. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, a million, that's 1 trillion, is a million. So if you imagine like a million apples, maybe we can visualize that, right? Now imagine a million stacks, each of a million apples, that's 1 trillion. And then do that 36 more times, and that's how many dollars we're behind. Like I said, I'm not sure I can really get it. Like, and I don't think anybody can.
Very good point. I want to shift gears here because you're the mining guy, and really want to learn as much as I can about mining. But the first question is, I hear all of this stuff about we should use green energy, wind and solar to run our miners. But is that a thing that people actually do in the real world? Off-grid wind and solar, and they can have the miner running a third of the time and not 2/3 of the time. Is that realistic at all or no?
With wind and solar, it works better on grid than it does off grid. In the point you made, which is something that only runs a third of the time, is very difficult to work economically. So on the whole, when you set up a mining operation, you want it to run a lot, pretty close to 24/7. Now, what can work, if you have a private solar as an example, or private wind, if you have a grid connection as well that is modest, and so it's nighttime or the wind's not blowing, and you can maybe make a small amount of money mining off the grid and then do really well when you're mining off grid, that kind of thing can work. We have for instance, we have a situation where we have a small site with a partner in Orlando, north of Orlando, with a greenhouse. And we also are venting the heat from the miners into the greenhouses. So we call that cogeneration, meaning we're also getting another use. So he's got solar there. We use the solar when we can. We can use the grid otherwise, and we're venting heat in. There's kind of a little economic thing that works in that kind of situation. Now, so, you know, those are two forms of green energy. For Barefoot, we also own our own hydroelectric facility in South Carolina. So that, I mean, now we need the water to flow, but water flows a little more consistently than wind blows and sun shines. So that can work well in an off-grid situation. And it also depends, and on nuclear, depends on what you call green. I'll leave that to each person to decide. To me, nuclear is green. It's phenomenal. And we're going to see more and more of SMRs, which is small modular nuclear, where you can have a 1 megawatt or 3 megawatts or something like that, which is still a lot of power. But you could see these SMRs, and you could see mining come up around these SMRs. And then natural gas, we do some work in the natural gas area. That's really nice. So like we're bringing up a new facility in Pennsylvania where we own some natural gas wells. And this is gas that's nowhere near a pipeline. There's really no way to economically get it anywhere. And it's beautiful gas, by the way, for those of you inclined that way. Like there's different types of gas and quality of gas, but in that area of the world, it's called the Marcellus Basin, part of like northern West Virginia, western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, right in there. That natural gas that comes out of there is like 98% methane. It's like really pure, great stuff. It doesn't have a bunch of other, which means it burns super clean, and sometimes it can even qualify for carbon credits. So this type of mining, I guess the point being, we're also doing one with anaerobic digestion in Indiana, where we're taking there's a dairy farmer there who has obviously a lot of cows, and the cows produce not just milk every day. they have 2 byproducts, and we're taking the cow excrement, feeding it into an anaerobic digester, which accelerates the process of creating methane from it. And then we're mining off of that. So again, we're taking this seemingly worthless thing and turning it into, energy production. Mining incents this sort of stuff. And it to me, it's a lot more of the future than big on-grid installations.
Okay, just so it's clear to me, how much uptime do you need in a year for it to make sense? Like, could you have one of your operations that's only up 60% of the time and you're flipping it on and off whenever the energy is there? Does that make any sense, or does it have to be way over 90 to make sense?
If the energy is cheap enough, you could make it work. But we would much prefer to work in the 90% scenario.
Okay. And could you conceivably make it work, though, where you you're turning it off and on a lot in a given day? It's not like it takes hours to warm up or anything, or does it normally?
You can turn on and off frequently during the day. You mentioned a long time ago about the 10-minute block times.
Yeah.
It depends on who you're mining with, and there's some technical details, but it'd be a lot better if like you're working for an hour or 2 and then you turn off, but you don't want to turn off every couple minutes. That would be very hard on the equipment, but it's possible to do it in short windows, but you really don't want to be like cycling like several times an hour on and off.
I was reading up on, I think it was perplexity.ai about you, and it said that you develop mining sites with rapid deployment capabilities, typically within weeks. Is that a thing where you can go there, you can find a source of energy and get there within weeks maybe, and then can you leave and go someplace else? Is it in any way nomadic, or you might stay there for years once you're there, typically? Or
Well, we typically are going to stay for years, but we are designed that if we need to get up and go, we can get up and go. Now, the concept of that maybe you're referring to, I think will become more popular, of more mobile-ish deployments that you have a generator, maybe a natural gas generator. Like it could work especially with natural gas. We have a natural gas generator and you have the mining equipment and it's sitting on a flatbed truck, and you can move from site to site and spend a week there and then go to another one and then go to another one. There are some scenarios where that could play out.
And I think you have said elsewhere that the future of mining may be more off-grid. As time goes on, you'll be off-grid more than you are now even. that right?
Yes. So part of it is, I'm going to oversimplify, but if we look at energy, okay, the electricity specifically, I should say, there's about 27,000 terawatt hours. A terawatt is a trillion watts. Again, we're back to that number, right? Okay. 27,000 terawatt hours annually of electricity used across the globe. Right now, the Bitcoin network is using about 160 terawatt hours annually, okay, which is about 0.5% of the world's electricity is being consumed for Bitcoin mining. We have, as a community, the mining community, we have gone out and pretty much exploited all the cheap energy there is. Okay, cheap, by the way, can be defined as cost per kilowatt hour. So the places where you can buy energy at, let's say, less than 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour, we own a really large percentage of that. Okay. Typical residential person in the US probably paying 12 to 14. Globally, it's like 14 to 16. Okay. So we've found all the cheap spots. Now, because of AI and because of high performance computing needs, which are exploding, those industries want the same energy. Okay. But they are different than mining in that we were talking about uptime, interestingly, before. Well, their uptime requirement is essentially 100. They need this consistently. And we can deal with 92 or 95 or 98 or even 60 in certain scenarios, right? So, which is typically what happens when you go off grid. Because when you go off grid, you generally also take on the responsibility of producing your own electricity. And you'll have a source of base energy, whether that's gas or water or wind or sun, and you need to convert it. So there is an additional responsibility. But now, after the capital cost and the cost of maintaining it, it's generally free. So we can still get costs significantly lower than anything available on grid. And it's what I call unpermissioned, which I think is the best thing for Bitcoin to have, unpermissioned energy that I don't need somebody else's approval. I don't need somebody else's competence in order for this thing to work. So additionally, on grid, if you want really low costs and you want a lot of energy, which is a lot of what the big mining companies want, now you're really trying to find a unicorn. It's really difficult, really, really difficult to find those. So what I like to do, and you talked about like how quickly we can deploy. Well, part of the reason I like to do small things quickly is what I tell my team. Let's do small things quickly. We find a 0.5 megawatt, a megawatt or 2 megawatts, and we can do it in a matter of weeks, be up and running. And then we can assess the market conditions and the next opportunity and decide if we want to go for it or not. If we were pursuing 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt kind of things, it would be difficult to find that off grid, number one. Number two, even if we found the site or a potential site, the build out is probably going to take a year, maybe more. Requires lots of permits, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of third parties involved. And when I start deploying, when I start the project to when I actually start mining is a really long time. So I may come up in completely different conditions than when I started. And so at least in the small projects, I come up in the same market conditions as when I had the idea, and I get to at least start the project with economics that I know are acceptable to me.
I have a couple questions about that 0.5%. I'd like to know how much energy is the current financial system using as a percent? Is it more than 0.5%? And then 10 years from now, how much do you think energy Bitcoin mining will take compared to now?
Yeah, well, it's a great question about the current system. And part of it is, where do you draw the line? Because first off, everything I've seen estimated, and it's hard to estimate, would say that yes, the existing banking system uses well over 0.5%. It's probably in the 1% range.
And nobody ever says we got to get rid of banking. It uses too much energy, right? I never hear that. Never.
Right. Or video gaming, or TVs, or Christmas lights, or microwave ovens, or like you pick it, all those sorts of things are going to be at least in the same order of magnitude as Bitcoin. The other thing, though, is that when we talk about the banking system, do I need to include at least a decent percentage of the Department of Defense budget, energy budget in that as well? Because the US dollar, in its position as the global reserve currency, is certainly dramatically impacted by the US's military strength. And without it, I don't think it would have nearly the panache. So you throw that in, well, that's a couple percent right there of world energy consumption. So, it's my belief that people should be very careful about protesting Bitcoin's energy usage, because essentially what they're doing is they're making a moral, ethical judgment about the use of energy. And if you open Pandora's box, especially here in the US, if we open Pandora's box to that, to say we are going to let somebody make a moral judgment about the proper use of energy, then what about pool heaters? What about pet beds? What about hot water heaters? What about microwave ovens? What is the justification of that energy usage? And I get upset by this, because there's a major faction within the world, often again, coming from what they label themselves as progressive people, who vilify energy usage. And they want to take people who use energy and say they are bad for using energy. Yet it is very clear that the quality of human life is directly related to energy usage. If you look at it on a timeline, or you look at it geographically, and it's maybe easier geographically, areas of the world which do not have access to consistent and inexpensive power are in poverty, and places that have access to lots of affordable and consistent power, they have very high quality of life. And I think for us to start vilifying energy consumption is to be telling a whole bunch of the rest of the world that they'll never achieve this living standard, or we're asking all of our existing people in the first worlds to go step back. Just not realistic.
So we are almost out of time here. Do you have any last minute points you'd like to make before we go ahead and wrap this one up?
I'll say this, that Bitcoin, there's a phrase, and the phrase is, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. I actually don't like the last part, that then you win. I prefer to replace that with then they embrace you. And Bitcoin has followed this path, that we spent 7 or 8 years from the launch in 2009 in the they ignore you phase. There's nobody even cared. Then it got just enough momentum that some people felt compelled to mock it, to say those that were supporting it were clowns. It's kind of like the first time that I think certain people found it to be a threat, and their reaction to it was to reject it, like mock it. Now, I think we're largely past that. There are some people that are stuck there, and they will never leave. Like they went too hard in that phase, I think, and they are not humble enough to admit their mistakes, so they are doubling down. But now we're in the fight you stage. So now, with a $2 trillion market cap and global adoption in the tens of millions of people, now the central banks of the world realize it presents a threat to their existence. Certain politicians, politicians are drawing lines. There's a group of politicians who said, we're going to leap to the embrace it stage. And their opponents are in the fight stage. Like they're going to try to fight it, because Bitcoin at the essence attacks the wealth and power infrastructure of the world as it exists today. So if you're somebody in that position of wealth and power, there's a lot of natural impetus to fight it, to try to, even if you can't beat it, to try to delay it. So I think we're at that stage where this is happening. And so I did an article for Financial Advisor magazine last month. And there were 2 papers written in October, one by the European Central Bank, one by the Fed, both attacking Bitcoin. And the summary of the one from the Fed, the essence of it said that if Bitcoin continues to persist, it will ultimately collapse the ability of the government to function with a deficit. And they tried to say this is a bad thing. It's kind of funny because in my response to it, I said, you're exactly right. And they've proven it mathematically, by the way. It was a guy, a PhD in economics, and he went through this whole mathematical proof. I thought it was brilliant, and he proved it. I said, congratulations. That's exactly why Bitcoin needs to exist. The European Central Bank, which released their report 4 days apart from the U.S. Federal Reserve, meaning this is a coordinated attack, wrote their papers on a different angle. The summary of that article is that Bitcoin will perpetuate massive wealth disparity in the world, and it's going to leave the poor people behind, which I found just amazing that they would write such an article with a straight face, that we live in a world where, and in my article, I'm going off the top of my head, I might be off a little bit, the top 1%, 1.5% of the world has like 70% of the wealth. And I think it's the top 10% has like 93%. So these people are saying that Bitcoin is going to disrupt the wealth distribution of the world. Like, how could it be any worse? Like, you've created this system that's existed since somewhere between 1913 and 1944, between the creation of the Fed and Bretton Woods. We've had this. The reason I'm kind of going through this with you right now, though, is that the fight you stage is going to get fierce. And because now it's like a real attack. Like, it's no longer hypothetical. It's real. And they're losing. And the election of Trump, and I'm not here to be political, but the election of Trump, part of that is a massive endorsement of this movement toward Bitcoin. And it's going to get more vicious. And so be very careful about what you read, because the mass media loves to quote PhDs from this institution or the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, and they look at that as some prestigious expert and affirmation of fact and truth, that it's coming from these people. So just be careful when you hear things about Bitcoin. At a minimum, look at them with a grain of salt, and do your own research. If something bothers you that they say, and you think it might be true, reach out into the Bitcoin community. The Bitcoin community is very engaging. My DMs are open. Like if somebody says something and it bothers you about energy consumption or wealth disparity or whatever, most people in this world are pretty open to helping that. In fact, I want to hear it because I want to know what they're saying. I want to try to get in front of it. And I'll close with this. Those organizations, like I have personally written CNN, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, like all these traditional organizations. And I've said, hey, I know you're writing articles on these topics. Here's all my contact information. I am completely available to speak from the perspective of Bitcoin on these topics. And by the way, there's plenty of other people. You mentioned like Parker Lewis, who wrote Gradually Then Suddenly, or my friend Larry Lepard, who's runs a big fund, or Saylor. I mean, Saylor's been very gracious with his time. There's plenty of very qualified, proficient people, and they will not talk to us. They will not talk to us. They do not want the truth. As Jack Nicholson says, you can't handle the truth.
Fantastic. All right, Bob Burnett, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this. I'd love to talk to you again if you have some time in the future, because I'm just eating this up. It's really great information. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.